Get ready.
Hey everybody, welcome to Replay, a conversation on the ins, outs, and upside downs of the games industry. I'm Greg Off, and I've spent 35 years in this business, from the magazine days to running Off-Base, a creative marketing agency that's worked with some of the biggest names in games. And what I've learned is that the most interesting stories in gaming aren't in the reviews or the press releases, they're in the conversations, the decisions, the near misses, and the moments that shaped what got made and how. That's what this show is, and I'm really glad you're here. So let's get into it. Welcome everybody. My guest today has spent 3 decades making the argument that video games are a legitimate art form, often before anyone wanted to hear it. She's documented gaming's golden age before it became history, collected nearly 500 arcade machines before it became fashionable, and is now building what she hopes will be gaming's first world-class museum. Her name is Burnham. She's the author of Supercade, one of the most important books ever written about this medium, and she's exactly the kind of guest Replay exists to talk to. Van, welcome, and thank you for coming.
I'm so honored to be here, Greg. Thank you so much. That was really sweet. Thank you.
Well, all right, we're gonna just jump right in. I know you've spoken. You've clearly, you've written amazing books. People know who you are, at least in the industry, and in certainly the arcade community. But I would love for our listeners to hear kind of about your how you got started, what your origin story is. I know you've described yourself as, a quote unquote arcade rat, that is. I would love, to kind of go back to, I believe it's Raleigh, North Carolina. What was the first game that grabbed you and what did that feel like? Like, what was that impetus?
Well,
that moment?
I was born in Raleigh and grew up in a little town called Cary, and it's just absolutely hilarious to me now that my small little hometown is now home to Epic Games, one of the most significant forces in the game industry. And the town has obviously changed quite a lot, but I always feel this bond to Epic because of that. But I actually grew up in New Jersey, and Supercade, the book, is actually named after the mall arcade that I would frequent at the Cherry Hill Mall. But my journey with games really, it began with my dad, who came home one day with an Odyssey home video game system, the very first Odyssey.
Is it the one with the dials?
Yes, the one with the dials. Yes. And this was, it was not when it was brand new. I'm guessing he got it on closeout somewhere. And, I was maybe 5 years old and trying to figure it out. And it was just this absolutely nebulous contraption with, just so many accessories and all these overlays. And I would just kind of make up my own games. And, but that really kind of instilled a love of technology. And then as I got older and, the arcade phenomenon really hit, I just remember being so consumed by all of it and would go to the arcade and just, it wasn't so much that I just loved playing the games. I just had this overwhelming feeling like this is important and you need to pay attention to this. And I would, walk around like, oh, this game was made by this company and they also did this game and this is what's similar about them. And even as a child, I was kind of looking at it through the lens of a historian, and I would buy the magazines and read about the new games coming out and try to learn about the developers and oh, somebody actually designed this game, and was just always really fascinated with it. And when I got to Wired magazine, I just kind of became the default games evangelist. I always felt like we needed to have more game content in the magazine. So I was always advocating for, covering some game's anniversary or some game launch or whatever. And it got to a point where, I had this idea of what a video game book could be. And finally, one of the editors just said, you need to just write this book because, obviously this is, what you're meant to be doing. And that grew into Supercade.
My first indelible memory with games, especially arcade games, was Pong at the local Carvel ice cream.
Oh, wow.
I was so fascinated by it that kind of like you, it sort of set me on that path to really just, I couldn't consume enough about the games and technology, whether it was home or arcade. So
that's amazing.
Clearly, I understand the bug that bit you for sure. And, the late 70s and early 80s was really, I think you're a unique individual in that I don't think a lot of people, at least on the consumer side, were seriously thinking about these machines as being, significant other than, something to hammer on and play for a quarter or two and move on. So, you mentioned even at that early age, you started to notice things that people probably didn't notice. Back, if you were to think about yourself back then, was that the moment you're or was that the time when you really just that seed blossoming, wow, this is more than just a pastime. It's something that needs to be really kind of thought of as, an art form, something that needs to be preserved, recorded, or thought about bigger than just,
Absolutely.
a hobby.
I mean, I think I always held games in this very high regard. I mean, I loved playing them, and I was very lucky that, I was one of the few kids that I knew that had a television in their room. And, I had, first I had my, my favorite. After the original Odyssey, then I got an Odyssey 2, and I thought that was just the coolest thing to ever exist. And I would
Casey Munchkin,
which was a better version of Pac-Man than the actual licensed Pac-Man. Totally, honestly.
Absolutely.
And I just thought it was so cool with that, the keyboard and everything. It was so beautiful. And I would play those games, and then I got a ColecoVision, and I would literally stay up all night trying to get 1,000,000 points on Mousetrap. And the fact that those games were so close to, the arcade originals, that was just amazing to me. And they did such a fantastic job with a lot of those ports. I just finished writing about Cosmic Avenger, and I'm looking at screenshots side by side. And, for the technology that they had then, it really is incredible. And, more people played that game on ColecoVision than they did in the arcade.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't want to get off on a tangent on ColecoVision, but I will say that is probably, from a retro perspective, that is my all-time favorite home console, without a doubt. Yeah. And what is mind-blowing, and this could be a whole nother episode, frankly, what's mind-blowing today is that all the homebrew communities that support the ColecoVision and the Intellivision and some of these other home consoles from a bygone era. It is. And what they're able to do now versus what the engineers and the programmers could do back in the 80s just is mind-blowing. You can even get much, much closer to that arcade pixel perfection that, they strived for back in the day.
Oh, absolutely. I'm completely obsessed with the Vectrex. And I'm trying to complete my collection of Vectrex games. And I've been looking at some of the new games that have been done, and it's just amazing. It's just incredible what some of the current creators have been building for these systems. And I love that so much. But
if you need to borrow, because it is prized for me, I am one of the lucky few that have something called the Vec Fever.
Oh,
have you heard of that?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah,
that's incredibly cool.
Which is a special cartridge that plays all the Vector arcade games. So
it's very cool.
Again, your obsession is my obsession.
Yeah,
for sure.
And it's an important thing. And the thesis, one of the central points of the second volume of Supercade was just talking about that point when home consoles didn't just meet the quality of arcade games, but when it started to surpass that. And that really happened with the Dreamcast. And that was a really important moment in time. And that's really when things shifted. Because up until that point, there was still greater graphical fidelity, with an arcade game. But at that moment, that's when it switched. And from then on, now, home consoles were really, graphically the dominant force in gaming. And now what we're able to achieve is just incredible.
And going back to, kind of the early days as a child, I think you were kind of a unique outlier in that, I'm sure there are plenty of young women and girls playing arcade games, but to really embrace it and look at that as something that you were probably unabashedly had a love for is super interesting to me and unusual, maybe even. And I was wondering, growing up, did gaming feel like something you had to justify to people, or were you doing it without worrying about whether it was legitimate?
I didn't really care. I was a little bit of a tomboy, a lot of a tomboy. I mean, I rode a BMX bike and played with Star Wars and, was just not interested in sort of things that, most girls are. Like, I could care less about, dolls and whatnot. And I wanted to be out building forts and, tearing things up. So, I came at it from that perspective, but at the same time, as part of the Avoid Missing Ball show, I was very grateful that Stanford University gave me permission to display some of the images taken by Ira Nowinski, who's this amazing photographer. I'm not sure if you've seen his work, where he was a very serious photographer. He was like the staff photographer for the San Francisco Opera. He had done a whole series on Holocaust survivors, and he was just obsessed with this phenomenon of video games. And he went around like 1981, 81, to various video arcades in the Bay Area and just took all of these candid shots. And I blew them up large format and displayed them. And really the core of it, and, what we forget is that back at that time, games was a very neutral territory. If you look at those photos, there's businessmen, businesswomen, young girls, young boys, black, white, gay, straight, everybody came together for this love of games. Like that whole construct that games are, a male-dominated thing, that's really kind of grown. That kind of really got going in like the mid-'80s. I mean, there was a little bit of like a focus on space shooters, and things kind of shifted when fighting games and more aggressive games started coming out. But in the beginning, I mean, we do hear this talk like, they made Centipede or Ms. Pac-Man to appeal to women, but the women were already there, like maybe not quite 50-50 like we see now, but they were absolutely present, and they're in all those photos, and it's not just girlfriends there with their boyfriends, they're playing games. Right. So I think a lot of that had to do with marketing, especially after the NES was released. I think a lot of marketing started to focus where it's like, if you look at all of the promotional images, especially from the 1970s and very early 80s, they show a family, and it's always a brother and a sister. It's a brother and a sister, and mom and dad, and everybody's playing games together. And the girls are just as excited as the boys are to play these games. But then if you look at the marketing materials further into the 80s, it's just a young boy playing, and the family is now out of the picture. And I think that was, for whatever choices were made, I think it was a mistake. But somebody decided, like, that's really our core demographic, and that's what we need to focus on. And that's when things started to come apart. And I think only recently, it's like in really the last 10 years, we've started to see things start to, come back together, so that, it's not viewed as being, this thing that's just for a very specific audience. And, it's much more inclusive. And that I think that's a really good thing.
I couldn't agree more. And if you look at some of that the marketing, especially as you got into the late 80s and the 90s, of, to your point, the kid in his, in his bedroom, hat turned backwards,
Oh yeah, and those are some great images.
Like,
don't get me wrong.
up.
Some of them are just absolutely fantastic. I've got a poster of this one Capcom ad that's just, the best thing you've ever seen. The teenage
Iconic.
boy in his bedroom playing his games. But
I'd
like to do the version of that with, the young girl like me.
I love it, as we should.
I'll recreate that ad someday.
Okay, so totally. So you ultimately, you said you ended up at Wired magazine in the mid 90s.
Yeah.
Obviously Wired is one of the most culturally influential publications during that decade, for sure. And you become the person in the building who's probably, I would imagine, having to challenge the editorial peeps to have games taken seriously.
It was an interesting time. So I was working for a magazine in New York City and had made friends with the production director at Wired, and I was in town visiting friends, and managed to get invited over for lunch, and I got the full tour of the magazine. And I remember he opened this door and a bunch of editors were in this little room, and this was when the Nintendo 64 was new, and everyone was in there playing, I think it was Mario Kart, I can't remember, but just everyone was in there playing games, and I'm just like, this is where I belong. The second he opened that door, I'm like, this is where all this digital culture stuff is really cool. But the fact that they were like not working, that they were in there playing video games together, I was like, this is where I need to be. And I said, if you ever need somebody, call me. And 2 weeks later, he said, well, I have to go start up Wired UK. Why don't you come on out? And so games was always very important to me. And one of the reasons that I loved Wired was that they did cover games. They had done some, there's a cover story on Sega. There's a cover story on a bunch of game creators. But as the 90s progressed, Wired became a little bit more of like a business magazine. Like once the .com really hit, that boom, it tended to focus more on like, oh, now we need to be more of a serious business magazine because this is big business now. And the games and other types of culture wasn't as significant. So I felt like that was my job to try to keep that in the book as much as possible. But, I had started thinking about the book that I wanted to do even when I was back in New York. I think I tell this story in the introduction to the first Supercade. I moved to New York City. I have a job now, and I moved into my first apartment, and my parents brought up a bunch of stuff of mine that was in the attic. And there was this box, this cardboard box that was just marked games and Sharpie marker, and I opened it up, and it was all of my game consoles from when I was a kid. That Odyssey was in there with the system base and all the games still in their boxes, and I was just like, oh wow. So I set up this gaming area in my apartment, and retro gaming didn't exist yet. This is like 1990 to 93. The internet was just barely getting going, and I would have my, rock star friends come over, and we would play video games. And I got a Sega Genesis, and we were playing Mortal Kombat. And when that came out, and, we had this whole, it was the beginning of what became the whole retro gaming community. And I started going on the internet and finding these little clusters of people online who were talking about video games. And at that point, there was 5 places where people were talking about old games. There was like CoinOp and CBG Nexus, and this is old. This is like ancient times. And I was working at a magazine doing graphics, so I had this really great scanner, and I took all these games in, and I scanned the manuals and the boxes and started putting that online. And nobody had done that up until then, and we're all sharing all this art, like, oh, do you have the manual for this game? And that was and now it's just crazy. Like it's huge now. There's like 20 major sites with information like that. But it's like that was the very beginning of it. And just the way I was, like whatever I was interested in, I loved having a book. I was, a very, design focused person, and whatever that it was a designer and an interior style or whatever, like I loved having a book, and I had a pretty good book collection. And I remember that I went down to the Rizzoli on Broadway, which is a beautiful bookstore, and went in and, went up to the counter. I'm like, well, where are the books about video games? I'm like, somebody must have done a book talking about all these games, because like now I've got money and I'm trying to remember all the games. And, I just thought that there would be this resource. And she took me over to a shelf, and there were 2 books. It was Zap, The Rise and Fall of Atari, and Game Over by David Sheff, which to this day is still my favorite book about games. But they were business books, just some black and white pictures, and that was it. And I'm just like, oh, this is great, but like this isn't what I wanted. I wanted like, full page images of, the game screens and talking about the history and who made the games. And I just had that kind of like just churning in the back of my mind for a long time. And then when the editors at Wired were like, yeah, you need to write a book, I'm like, you know what? Yeah, I do. And I sat down and started, putting down exactly what it was going to look like, and was very lucky to get a publishing deal with MIT, and ended up leaving Wired to finish the book. But it's been quite a journey, and it's been my focus ever since.
And then you tracked down like all of the, maybe not all, but all engineers and artists who made the games. Whether Ralph Beer, of course, Nolan Bushnell, Ed Log, Shigeru Miyamoto. These were living people, right, who hadn't necessarily been asked to tell their stories at that level of depth. What were those conversations like?
It's always a process. It's amazing getting to speak to the creators, and it's something that I'm pushing for very hard right now, because these people are starting to leave us. And we've gotten a lot of stories. A lot of the stories have been repeated a million times, but there's a lot of holes in that history. I just finished writing about King and Balloon, which is a not very well-known game, but it is incredibly significant in the history of games, because there's a very famous story that at the AMOA show in 1980, Namco didn't want anybody to be upset. So Namco brought 4 games to that show that year that they were, offering to licensees in the US. The first was King and Balloon. They had Rally X. They had a game called Tank Battalion, and they had Pac-Man. And, it came down to 2 different manufacturers that were interested in the Namco games. It was Midway, and it was a small little company called GPI. And the story goes that there was a coin toss, and Game Plan won the coin toss, and they picked Tank Battalion. Now, this is a story that's been repeated, and sometimes it gets distorted that, they picked,
Sure.
that Midway won and they picked Pac-Man, and, that they were smart, but nobody knows the exact dynamic. So like what I know from the histories that I've read is that I'm confident, like from all of the interviews, that the game that Midway thought was going to be the big hit was Rally X. So if that coin toss was a turn-based thing, that means that GPI picked Tank Battalion. Midway then picked Rally X, which means that GPI then would have picked King and Balloon for Pac-Man to go.
Right.
But like nobody knows, like we just know the rough outline of that story. And I reached out to another historian who I have so much respect for, Keith Smith. If you haven't visited his blog, it's called All in Color for a Quarter. And he is just an incredible historian that has done a lot of really deep research and reached out to everybody. And I immediately emailed Keith, and I'm just like, I don't, their names are escaping me right now, but I know the 2 guys who did that coin toss. They were both, head of sales. And I'm like, are either of those guys still alive? He's like, no, the one died in, 2019 and the other one died, year before last. And it's like, oh my God, like, we need to get these stories before these people are gone. And I did this exhibition last year that was just absolutely an amazing opportunity and experience with Eisenberg. And I wish that you could have seen that at the Space Gallery at their offices in Pasadena. That was tracing the history of video tennis and what evolved into Pong. And I'm like, oh, it'd be so great to have Al Alcorn come down for the opening of this show. And I reached out to him, and he's like, well, Van, I'm getting kind of old. And I'm like, yeah, Al, you're getting kind of old. So let's do this. And we're going to bring in all the USC interactive students, and you're going to get to tell these amazing stories and share your history. And, it was all recorded. And, the USC students, like, their eyes were just like, like saucers, like listening to this history. He's never gotten the credit that he deserves. Like, everybody thinks that he just, he's Pong. No, he's not just responsible for Pong. He's basically responsible for Apple, too. He hired Steve Jobs when they wanted to call security and escort him out of the building. He saw what was there and gave him the opportunity. And then when Apple was just getting started, nobody was going to sell them the chips that they needed to go into to manufacture the Apple II. It was Al who called and convinced the Motorola to do the deal with them so that they could get the chips. So, like, he is just such an incredibly important figure, like, not just in the history of the games, in the history of technology, and getting these stories on record. And I mean, he's been interviewed a lot, but there's a lot of smaller people. Like, I'm absolutely beside myself. I'm so excited. There's a small company that doesn't get any discussion in the history of games called Karateko, which was they had an office in Japan, and they turned into like one of the major distributors in Europe. And it was just such a cool company. And like, they were responsible for bringing Dig Dug and, Time Pilot into Europe. And there's just absolutely, like, I started researching it, and there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. And I, just started following some leads and got in touch with someone, part of the family. And now I'm talking to, the former head of that company and getting his story and all the details around that. And it's just this incredible history that otherwise, and he's in his 80s, and it's, he's having to, it takes him some time to get back. But, having these stories preserved is just so incredibly important. And the history, it disappears so fast. Like, all it takes is one person, who was like the last person who had that information, and they're gone, and everything gets scattered. And, that's why having institutions to preserve this history is so important. And I'm so grateful that we have the Strong Museum. They are doing an incredible job of saving archives and doing that work. But one is not enough. Not one institution cannot do everything. And I get some pushback sometimes, like, oh, why are you going to do another museum? We have that. I'm like, there are 8 major contemporary art museums just in Los Angeles. 8 major contemporary art museums in Los Angeles, like significant art museums just in Los Angeles. And, the idea that, we've got one on each coast, like that seems like too much. Like, no, it's still not enough. And, hopefully, having, the idea of preservation seems to be getting a little more traction now, and the companies seem to be caring a little more about it. But it is a major issue, and not just preserving the history from the past, preserving the history from the present. This was a major point in the second volume of Supercade. I was so grateful that Ed Fries wrote this beautiful essay on what we're calling the ephemeral age, which is that with the advent of digital distribution, there are no longer any game boxes to scan or magazine ads to preserve the moment. It's just, once it's done, once it's pulled, it's gone. And you can't even play it anywhere. There's nowhere to play some of these games, like some really significant games. If they're not picked up for Steam or some, archive collection, like, it's gone. So, that's a major concern for me, and how we're going to deal with that, because it's just going to continue getting worse. We have this huge amount of content. Like, one of the topics at DICE this year was just the overwhelming amount of content And so much of that is just instantaneously being lost. Like the second somebody loses funding, or the servers go down, like that's it, and those games can't be played anymore. The only record of some games we're going to have are Let's Play videos on YouTube, and that's terrifying to me, that like nobody will be able to actually play these games anymore in the future.
Absolutely, it is. It is really a sad state of affairs, frankly, and thankfully, people like you and Frank Cifaldi, are at least trying to fight against the tide of just technology. Yeah. And as someone who grew up with the boxes and going to Toys R Us and getting the little ticket and going looking at the little flip plastics and basing your choices on screenshots or reviewing the magazine.
And not even the actual screenshots. It was a drawing of the screenshot.
Right. Yeah.
It was an artist's representation.
Right. Colored paper. Yeah, absolutely. Talking about ColecoVision, right? A lot of those things were just like construction paper. No, it's amazing that you're fighting that good fight, Fan. It's so important. And, in a weird way, and this is probably controversial, I'm thankful for piracy sometimes, because a lot of those people are at least figuring out ways to scrape those games and get them off of a server and onto a hard drive somewhere that it can still be played. But
I have a very it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it is an incredible resource, but I can't even tell you how many incredibly rare games have come into the collection that are missing the original ROMs. And the reason those ROMs are gone is because somebody pulled them to dump them and they didn't put them back. And like that's where I start to have an issue. It's like, I'm fine with you pulling the ROMs and dumping them, but you have now essentially destroyed the last surviving example of this game. So, that's something that there needs to be a little more stewardship around that. There needs to be some there needs to be some practices. And people, they do it because I'm going to be the person that dumps this rare game. But it's just an ego thing. It has nothing to do about preserving that game, because you've just destroyed the original game in order to do that. So, I think that there needs to be a higher level of stewardship around all of that. But at the same time, there's some games that the ROMs are bad, and I'm able to copy them because somebody has dumped them from another board. So, it both assists with restoration and also, it kind of works both ways. Unfortunately, we need to get it just working in the positive direction.
Yeah, no, exactly. And particularly myself, I was, in magazine publishing for a decade plus, from 91 to 2004. And if only I could go back and slap myself upside the head, old Greg, past Greg, all of those EPROMs and gaming ephemera and discs and the games that were never released, all of that stuff, either was destroyed, went into dumpsters. It pains me to no avail. Just to think about that.
I'm very lucky to be the hoarder that I am. I keep everything. So I have I've got just boxes and boxes of every press kit that was ever sent to me at Wired, every scrap. So I do. That's kind of a center of some of the archives. So we didn't really talk about it. So as I was working on the books, I started to amass this collection of games. And it started out with just home console games that I really, when I was doing the first book, I wanted to have the original examples there, not just to do research, but, to have for photography and for reference, and, build a fairly comprehensive collection of home consoles, plus all of my archives from covering games for so many years. And then when I got to LA, I started, I kind of had a little bit of a moment where I was like, oh my God, I've written these books about games and I don't have an awesome arcade. Like I'd seen like just, there was a bunch of collectors who had these really cool basement arcades. There's this one guy, Peter Hirschberg, who was just an absolute legend, who built this arcade called Luna City. And I was just like, I need an awesome arcade. So I totally lost my mind one Christmas and bid on 3 games on eBay, thinking that I'd maybe win one of them. And of course I won all 3 of them. Yep. And, I had to figure out the logistics of, how do you even go about, shipping a 250-pound game. And, they got to the house and I didn't have anywhere to put them. So they lived on the front porch for a while. We called it the front porch arcade, and all the neighbors would come over. It was a very good time. Like
was it enclosed? No,
it was not. And like, so when winter started coming, the rain coming, I'm like, we need to have an option. And thank God, the building next door came up for lease, and I was very fortunate to be able to get in there. And then that was a much larger space. So I just started, amassing this large collection of games. And in the beginning, it was like I want to just have all the games that were featured in Supercade, but it's just grown beyond that. So, when I lost the space, the landlord sadly died during COVID, and the building was sold. And at that point, I'm like, you know what? It's time to get serious about opening a public-facing interactive museum, and that's what I'm working on now. It's been a little bit of a challenge because of conditions in the game industry. The last 2 years, it is everything was so amazing. Everything just was incredible into and coming out of the pandemic, and the last 2 years have just been a real challenge for everybody. So I'm still
hot mess for sure.
Yeah, it's like it's like some of my sponsors are like, we just laid off several hundred people. So the philanthropic budget is not really what it used to be. But I think things are starting to turn around, and just trying to build some support for that. And I'm still trying to identify the best location. There's one space that I really love that I'm trying to work out. But it's going to be a major initiative, and just building support for that. So all of these games have a safe haven, and I can finally have some staff to help with all of these projects.
When did you go from walk me through the process, or what happened between I went crazy. I had a moment where a lapse of judgment, and I bid on 3 arcade games because I wanted to recapture my nostalgia. I'm sure because that's what I do. To all of a sudden, holy shit, I have way too many arcade games. I can't stop. What am I going to do I should open a museum? Like, was there a progression, or did you automatically think this is what I need to be doing? It just kind of
felt like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And for me, I do have some more common stuff, but my focus really is getting those more rare and obscure games, because they are still being destroyed. Like, I can't even tell you. This is a great story that Tim was actually involved in, our mutual friend Tim. There's a very rare game called Abscam, which was a Pac-Man clone inspired by the Abscam scandal, which is just fantastic. It was made by a little company called U.S. Billiards, who are based out of Amityville, the same Amityville of the Amityville horror fame. They started out in the pool business. They built pool tables, and then when games started going, his son was like, "Oh, we need to get into games," so they started building games, and they did some really cool games. One of my favorite Pac-Man clones, a game called Piranha, which I'm sure you've seen. It's pretty famous.
I'm aware of it.
And then they did this game Abscam. So it was one of those games that's like, there's no surviving examples. Just a lot of games just went extinct. Games operators had absolutely no affection for games. If something wasn't making money, they either converted it to something else, or they demolished it and threw it in a dumpster. Like they had no affection for these. It's different now, but back then it was just about making money. And the second something stopped earning, it had absolutely no value to them. So a lot of these smaller games that didn't do well, they're just, nobody was holding on to them. Nobody was saving them. And it just seemed like that was one of those games that, just disappeared. And there's a lot of them. But then miraculously, I can't even remember where it popped up. Maybe on Craigslist, suddenly there's an all totally original, totally intact Abscam. And by the time somebody forwarded it to me, somebody else had gone in there and bought it with the intention of turning it into a MAME cabinet and just using the cabinet and MAMing it. And they had pulled all of the Abscam. No, you don't understand. Like, it's physical.
Excuse me.
Yeah. Yeah. So somebody had already bought it and already gutted it. And I mobilized, and I'm like, we need to get all those parts, get the cabinet. I got in touch with the guy who bought it. I'm like, whatever you paid, I'll double it. Got the original cabinet. We managed to track down all of the parts, and Tim was instrumental in that. And a guy named John Exedy, who is awesome. He's involved with One Up. I think that this game was in Colorado, and he's based in Colorado. So John went and got the cabinet. Tim got all the parts together, and then all of it was shipped to me. So, it's probably the next project. As soon as the book is done, my plan is to pull that out and get it back together so that can be taken up to California Extreme. I'm going to try to do that in time for this year so that people can play Abscam again. But it is the only known surviving example, and it was almost destroyed. And it's like, it just, it takes it takes a village to preserve these games sometimes. And I'm grateful to everybody who helped with that.
A couple of things strike me, just in our discussion is like, you're like a detective. like you have to be a sleuth, right? To not only track down like these people, this information. I don't know if you have a team or not, but I don't know how you can get all that done.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I mean, I enjoy doing that. And, one of the things that I love doing the most in terms of my preservation work is, and this happened with the arcade games a lot, is that, you have some rare, obscure game that's not doing well and the operator would convert it to something else. So let's just take, for example, there's this amazing Universal game called Cheeky Mouse. That's very rare. I think they have one at Fun Spot. That's the only, it's an amazing arcade in New Hampshire. That's the only one that I know of. So I got a hold of one, and it had been converted to Mr. Do, which was a very successful game for Universal. So pretty much like any rare, obscure Universal game was most likely converted to Mr. Do. Just like any obscure Tato game was converted to Arkanoid. It's like, I've got a Quarkanoid, I've got a Jarkanoid, I've got like a million games, rare games that were converted to Arkanoid. Yeah. So, I have to go through this process, and like, Arkanoid deserves to be preserved, but let's get it out of the electric yo-yo cabinet because like that really needs to be rebuilt. So, tracking down all the original parts to make that game hold again. It's never going to be factory original, with numbers matching, which is, it's just like classic cars. If you find a game and, it's got the same matching serial number on the monitor, on the board, on everything, then that's a really special thing, and you don't mess with that. But, you track down all the parts and, put it back together again. I've done that a few times. And that's probably the most rewarding thing is bringing back a game that was otherwise, destroyed or extinct and making that playable again.
Yeah. I think I already shared this with you prior to this conversation. My kind of like, I don't know, holy grail, whatever you want to call it, was Sky Skipper for Nintendo. Having that, I have like, nostalgia is a very powerful thing for me. And for whatever reason, those Nintendo cabinets from the 80s with the little circular speaker vent and, they're very iconic, to the point that my creative agency, our brand colors are Donkey Kong Jr. and Donkey Kong 3. Those are the three brand colors of it's like our little Easter egg. Anyway, that story about Sky Skipper, and for the audience, it's a long story, but the TLDR is it was this Nintendo game, arcade game. I believe Miyamoto worked on it. It tested so poorly that they decided not to put it in the market. So any boards that were were made, were converted to Popeyes. The cabinet never went into production. I mean, there was a cabinet with side art and whatnot. And so it just so happened someone found one, like a picker. I might have even been in a barn. I don't know, but they found a board that happened to be Sky Skipper. And we're able to figure out that you could, like, there were a few boards out there that were converted Popeye that could be converted back. And long story short, the Nintendo had the one and only cabinet that was in their break room for God knows how long, and then put into a storage room. Yeah, and so they were able to find the cabinet, find the board, recreate the side art, actually go and scan it and all that stuff. And so it might have grown. I've not looked in a while, but there were 12 known Sky Skipper boards, and I was so fascinated by that I've been like, that's been my hunt. And I was able to eventually find one probably about 8 months ago.
Wow.
And I worked with, I was not able to get the original scans or any of the artwork from the people that were able to recreate it. So I recreated it myself, like you, graphic design background. And then I worked with Galloping Ghost, because they have their own, not only do they have this amazing arcade, they actually have an arm that does that services the arcade by printing, whatever. So they helped me recreate all the side art and the CPU, the marquee and the control panel and all the good stuff. And so I recreated, the cabinet myself. And it's like my prized possession. And of course it's on the Fritz right now. So I got to figure out how to get it back working. My gosh. But that is the plight of arcade. Arcade games.
I think I was supposed to have one of those art sets, because I don't know if you saw it. I actually wrote about that discovery for Retro Gamer.
I did,
and was very lucky to go out to Atlanta when they did the big reveal of the cabinet that they put together. So that was just incredible. And then went up to Nintendo of America and got the tour of the archives there. And that's when Don James was still there. He told me that whole story. He was very instrumental in helping them make that happen. And I just love Nintendo so much, and the fact that they worked with these collectors to recreate this game, like they took it very seriously, and we're a big part of making that happen. And normally, everyone thinks that these games are very closed and protective, and they can be, but they can also, just be an incredible resource. And that was a real shift when that happened, because it was really the first time that, a publisher had collaborated with collectors to preserve something. And it's just such a fantastic story. And it's a really cool game. Like, I don't understand why it tested as poorly as it did. Some of the graphics are just incredible. There's these scenes where he gets knocked out and there's just stars going everywhere. It's just some incredible artwork in that game. But it's a fantastic story. And the fact that you pulled one together is just awesome.
Yeah, it's my prize and joy,
awesome.
For sure. And we were talking about, before we came on air, we were talking about superscalers.
Yes.
Specifically, which are a certain era of and a certain subset of Sega arcade games.
The Tycoon games
in the mid-'80s.
Which I saw it. The Tycoon, yes. I this is actually a mistake in my second book. I thought that it meant like games that move, and then I found out fairly recently, no, it means games that make you sweat.
Interesting.
And so that's like, I had this totally wrong idea about what that meant. But Sega, and it really, I think the first one was Hang On. I think that's really what started it. That you had to like move to play the game, and then that and a lot of that just came out of Suzuki-san. And, created this incredible line of games that included, Afterburner and Outrun and Radmobile and Thunderblade and,
Thunderblade,
so the first one that I got was an Afterburner, which it's working. It still needs, I need to really like disassemble the motor, and I've not been wanting to do that. It's a horrible big job. but I'm trying to get them all, and a deluxe outrun came up here in Southern California, and I was like, oh, I need to get that. So I went with a friend of mine. I got a truck and went down to pick it up, and there was no way to get it out of the room that it was in. It was, too large. There was absolutely no way to get it out. So my friend and I, with no preparation or time, had to completely disassemble that outrun to get it out of there. And it is still in pieces because the owner, he passed away, God rest him. But he had done like not the best job of, he did a repaint on the Ferrari, on the car. That's just, it's not quite factory correct. So I'm like, I'm trying to find like a really good, like, I need to find a good shop to redo it. So I'm going to, redo the paint and then reassemble it. I'll hopefully when I have the future museum space, we'll get that put back together. But I'm trying to find right now the deluxe Space Harrier. That's the next one that I'm really hoping to, add to the collection, and then hopefully have room for all of them. And that's like one of the exhibitions that I would really like to do when the museum opens, is on all of those Sega games and go through that whole history, because they're just so cool. And a Sega R360. Have you ever played a Sega R360?
I've never been inside one. So I've not played them. I've been in arcades with them. I also Galaxy Force was was another one of those ones that were like, it was an experience like the R360. You're not going upside down, but you're definitely like, a lot of these games, for the listeners who aren't aware, they have hydraulics.
Yeah, the whole cabinet moves
a lot. Yeah, super cool. Which I can only, I'm sure is a technical nightmare to keep up in this day and age.
It's also a liability nightmare, which is
right.
Some of these games. I think that there was one. I think it was at Atari. Oh my gosh! And Owen Rubin. I'm blanking on the name of the game, but it was like a full motion game. And they tell this story where like some people were testing it. It would just throw these kids, like just throw them right out of the machine, and it's like. Need a 5-point harness. It was a different time. Yeah. You could not do that. You could not do that now. But it's a lot of fun. Risking your life.
Do you think you and I are enthusiasts, but and we appreciate games and believe wholeheartedly that they're a legitimate art form. Do you think that the world's caught up to that?
I think we're getting there. So when I was back at Wired and advocating for games and starting to work on the book, talking to somebody about games being art, it was like their eyes would just glaze over. Like, games were children's toys because they were sold at Toys R Us, and that was really my mission. The first, for that first decade, was convincing people like, no, games are not toys. It's an artistic medium. And, it took a while, but that dialogue, started to finally get some traction. And, now we've got games in the permanent collection of MoMA. And, Chris Melisinos did his incredible exhibition at the Smithsonian. And it's the beginning, but it still is not quite where it needs to be. Right before the pandemic, I was working on a museum exhibition that was a survey of contemporary art inspired by video and computer games, which still hasn't really been done properly. And I was meeting with major museums throughout the world to try to, find a home to launch this. Yeah. And I still encountered a lot of bias, especially in the art world. There's a lot of bias against games where it's not taken seriously. And that's something that I will continue to advocate to break that down. And that's why I always include an art component. There will be a very large art component in the future museum, because it is just as significant as literature or music, especially now in the culture that we have today. So It's an ongoing mission.
Is there one game or like experience that you would want you would most want someone who has never played a video game to experience first? Like one that would prove your argument.
Oh wow! I think any game has the power to inspire. I don't. There's the canonical classics, and those games are significant. But I remember in the old Supercade space, one day we had the graduate class from USC over to play the games in the arcade there, and there was this one young game designer who was just absolutely obsessed with Atari's Gotcha, which is a very early maze game, one of the first like video maze games, aside from Mouse in the Maze. And it's just got the cabinet has this incredible 1970s design, and it's very modern and it's very abstract. And he was just totally wrapped with this game. And it's like for an hour. And like, I just kept thinking like, how is that influence going to show up in the games that he designs? And I think that there's not enough exposure to the classics within the industry itself. Like you look at film, film takes its history very seriously. You cannot work in film if you do not have a solid knowledge of the history of film. There is they take it. It's part of that process is that you have to be completely steeped in it and have a reverence for it, and that doesn't necessarily happen in games yet. And I think part of it is just that the industry doesn't necessarily take its history as seriously as it needs to yet. And I think that that's part of what I'm advocating for, and I hope to get to that place where you it's not just a single history of games 101 class that you take. Like if you're studying film, the history of cinema is part of everything you do. You want to graduate from film school. It's not just one class that you take on the history of film. The history of film is integrated into literally every single thing that you're studying. And I do hope that games will follow that model and, learn from the film industry. This is one thing that I mentioned on LinkedIn a couple weeks ago. It's like, there are like 10 serious major archives for the preservation of the history of film that's funded by the industry. And the music industry too, and the game industry, just does not have that level of stewardship yet. And that's what really needs to change, because it should not be up to just people like me to self-finance the preservation of this history. It is a huge burden. I have to pay to store all of these games every month to keep them from being lost and destroyed. And I do it, and I find a way to do it, but I need help. So and I need the industry to step up and really take that seriously. So
how can we do that? Like, what is the ways that people can get involved and help from your perspective?
Well, it's just building awareness. It's like it just needs. Things have been very difficult the last 2 years, and I know that the game industry in general has just been really struggling. Just a lot of things need to change in terms of it's one facet of a much bigger problem, which is that the game industry has just made some decisions that weren't necessarily ideal, and we've gotten to a place where the way things currently are is just not sustainable. It's not. And like, I get very upset that those cool smaller console games that really are some of the most interesting, exciting games, like those just don't exist anymore. You've just got these huge several $100 million games, and it's rarely ever a new IP, just driving this huge machine. And like, we need to find a way to get back to being able to make these smaller games. And it's honestly, it's the same thing that's happened with the film industry. Like in the film industry, like the $15-20 million movies don't exist anymore. You've either got a 50 million plus movie, or you've got a 5 million or below movie. It's just completely split. And that's also happening in the game industry. Like you've got some incredibly, creative and exciting indie games, but they're just, small little indie developers on Steam, that don't really have any support. And every once in a while they'll get really lucky and have a huge hit, but they don't have, real publisher support. And, publishers aren't doing prototype deals anymore. Like the burden is completely on developers. Like, it's amazing that we have these tools for creating games, but now the expectation is like, no, we're not just going to like look at a vertical slice anymore. We want to see like the complete game before we decide if we're going to get behind this, putting the entire burden of development on these small studios. And it's really, it really makes it difficult to innovate. It's like, I get very nostalgic for the 90s, especially when I was researching the new book and, reading the stories of, the publishers who took a chance on the small little studio. Like Rare had never made a console game. Yeah. And they were given, the opportunity to do GoldenEye. And, that would never happen now. Just like, oh yeah, they've got the passion, they've got some vision, let's give them a chance. Like that just, it can't happen because the budgets are just too out of control. Right. But it's like, so we need to find a way to, bring that spirit back in the industry, because it's, it's why everything's falling apart. It's like I don't want to get too political about it, but it's like there needs to be a better balance between the market and creativity in order for things to really survive and thrive again.
I mean, this is a really important conversation, so I definitely don't want to shy away from it. Do you feel like that? I mean, it's a slow burn, but do you feel like that's happening? I mean, clearly, the era of these insanely huge but big budget games feel like it's become to your point, not sustainable. It's too much money, and like there's only probably 3 or 4 now that do it. Call of Duty, like what have you. So I wonder, if the shift will continue, and we'll see more of the, what do they call them? The triple I's, those smaller teams. They're not, it's not 2 guys in a garage, but it's not 400 people, at a huge studio. I wonder if that will continue and we'll see some more innovation, or do you think that it's just going to continue to be the way it is, and it's a mess that will just continue to be that way?
I'm hoping that it's going to continue to improve. Don't get me wrong. Like I love those big budget games. Like they're amazing. It's incredible, but it needs to be balanced. It can't just be that and little indie games. Like we need to have, your Vib ribbons, those games that are just really just creative and cool, that are supported by the publishers. I think some publishers do a really good job. I know that Chris at Xbox has been doing an incredible job of supporting new talent and new creators, and it just needs to be a priority for everybody, and just figuring out a way to shift the business dynamics so that it makes sense again, and everybody is so down on AI in games, and I get that. But there is a lot of potential benefit with some of these tools, and it's not about the tools. It's when people who don't have any vision are given powerful tools, that's when bad things happen. Mm-hmm. But if you give the right creators those tools where it can just make things easier, and cheaper and faster, then that's potentially a really good thing. So I think, there's this paranoia that, if AI is involved in games, that means that all games are going to turn into AI slop. And that's not necessarily how it can go down. Like if you give the right tools to the right creatives and it allows them to, make a $25 million game for $15 million, then more of those games are going to get played. Anyway, it's a big problem.
No, it is a big problem. And I absolutely see, that potential to allow creatives to be more creative, because if you can offload some of the other stuff so that you can, be more efficient and let your creativity bloom using tools, then that is a win.
Right? There's this huge, tremendous upside. Like it has been an absolute godsend for me. And it's the only reason that I'm back on schedule right now. So like just previously, if I was starting to research a game, I would spend, hours, sometimes days, tracking down primary sources, finding interviews, whatever. And now I have an agent trained up that's basically just my research assistant. So I'll be like, okay, this is what I'm working on. Go find me all the interviews on X and Y and Z. And it'll find interviews from Japanese magazines that normally I would never get access to, and totally obscure, right? And translate it for me. So now I have just this incredible, much more information than I was able to access before. And, sometimes things get off track, but, you have to guide it, and you got to double check everything. You can't take anything at face value, but when it's right, it's fantastic. Exactly. And, it's allowed me to do in, 2 hours what would have taken 2 days. And it's right. It's an incredible collaborative ally for me. But it's about using the tools in the right way. And I don't have it right for me. I don't have it, do the things that, takes away from my work, but it supports me, and it reduces a lot of friction in everything that I have to do. And the fact that, I can just glance down and in 20 seconds, everything that I need is now on my phone, rather than me going down a rabbit hole for days, getting distracted by, the million other things that come up doing that research. It's been fantastic. And, and that doesn't just apply to me writing, like that applies to any creative endeavor, including making games. So.
By the way, did you ever find out who did the animation for Badlands?
I did, actually. Yes,
amazing.
I did. It was Toei, and I'm waiting to hear back from them. I'm trying to get in touch with their archivist to see if they have any other information. But I'd done a post on LinkedIn just talking about how history disappears, and I had mentioned the situation with Karateko, and also I was researching a very cool the first and only Laserdisc game done by Konami, which was called Badlands, and it was licensed to Century here in the United States, and it's a very rare Laserdisc game. And there is just absolutely no information about the team that worked on it, about who did this incredible art for it. And I'm like, well, you know what? I'm going to figure that out. And so some secrets were unlocked, but there's still so much. There's still more. So much more. Yeah. But yes, we know who did the animation for Badlands now, and I've included that in the updated deluxe reissue of the original Supercade, which is what I'm working on now. We probably should have mentioned that up front.
Yeah, well, let's wrap it up there, because I think that's really important. A couple of things. Let's talk about that. What is the book? Yeah. What will the book have, including
my first book, Supercade, chronicled 1971 through 1984, which was when the industry basically fell apart the first time. And it was published by MIT Press, and I was very excited to work with them. They're a very prestigious publisher. but they were also a little bit cheap, I have to be honest. So there was a bunch of things that I wanted to include in the book that they wouldn't let me do. I wanted to include some, fifth colors and a gatefold in chart where the pages fold out, and they pulled all of that. And I was, and they really rushed the schedule. So some of the art was not 100%. I was never really happy with it. Like it was great. I'm so thrilled that it got the recognition that it did, but like it was always in my mind this flawed creation because it wasn't quite what I had imagined it was going to be. So
we're getting the remaster.
Yeah. So when I went to do finally, for years people have been like, "Oh, are you going to do a sequel?" And it didn't seem like the right time yet. And then during the pandemic, I realized, all of those games from the next era are now considered classics. So I did a Kickstarter to do the second volume of Supercade. There it is. And I got an incredible response and was just so grateful to have the resources to do it exactly the way it needed to be done. And I didn't just put one gatefold in there. I put 4 in and did all the, metallic, silver, special colors. And it was really spectacular. And I was really happy with that book. Like that, that was what I imagined it needed to be. So finally, MIT sold out of the original book. Finally, it took 20 years, but they finally sold out, and I was able to get the rights back. And I decided that I was going to do a revised deluxe edition of the original book and bring it up to the standard that was set by the sequel. So I added over 100 pages of new games and new content, and I didn't include an essay on electronic arts founding in the first book, and there's just a lot of things that were left out, mostly because they limited my page count. I had to cut a lot of content, but so it's really going to be spectacular, and I'm excited. I'm excited to have them both be the way they're meant to be.
Where can people find Supercade, the collection, and also information about the museum project?
So the new deluxe edition of Supercade is available for pre-order on the Supercade online shop, which is shop.supercade.com. And information about the museum is at supercademuseum.org. I need to do a new website for the museum. This is just a temporary website, but there's some information up there in terms of, how people can connect. And, people can always connect with me on social media. I have, links to everything there as well.
Great. I was going to ask if they can find you on X/Twitter.
Yeah, both on Instagram and on the former Twitter. It's Supercade71. Just the word Supercade 71, which is the year the first commercial video arcade game was released, and the year I was born. So it's meaningful to me.
I have one last question. I ask this every episode. So the name of the show is Replay, and I wanted to ask you if you could go back and replay one game, experience it completely fresh for the very first time. What would that be? I know. I stump everybody with this.
There's so many. It's hard for me because so many games are special to me. I would.
Desert Island.
I can only take one game. It would be the game that's behind me, Galaga. Yeah. It's a very kind of very basic answer to that question, but there's a reason for that. It is just one of the most fun games ever made. So yeah. When it came down to if I have to take a break when I'm writing, this one is a close second would be Pac-Man, which in that little machine is exactly like the one that was in the corner store by my house that I would stop and play after getting off the school bus pretty much every day. And it's interesting because I never knew why I remembered it having silver T molding. And then I found this one with silver T molding, and like, it's, I don't normally get nostalgic, but that's one thing that I'm very nostalgic about, because that game was very special to me during that time. And anyway.
Super cool. Yeah. I know we got to go, so I'm going to wrap it up, but just wanted the last thing, like for me, again, going back to the nostalgia, I don't know if you grew up around bowling alleys or not, but I think that's probably where my love of arcade games really kicked in overdrive. Because like, as a child of the 70s and 80s, like my parents would go bowling and they just, give me a roll of quarters and like tell me to get lost for, 2 hours or whatever. And that was what I did. And the going to California Extreme, that soundtrack of all the mix of different arcade noises and music is that's like music to my ears.
Oh yeah. I agree completely.
Yeah. All right.
You're going to love another project. It's a secret project right now, but I'll have to tell you about that because you're going to love it.
All right. We'll take that offline. Amazing. Thank you, Van. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on and waxing poetic and giving us a little bit more information about what you got going on. It's so important. And I would encourage everybody to check out that amazing collection of books that you've written and are writing, pre-order and purchase. And we will talk again
awesome.
soon.
And anybody who pre-orders the book, until it ships, you will get your name in the book. So excited about that.
Very cool. I want my name in the book. I have pre-ordered.
Well, then you're already there.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm good.
So much fun.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. And that was Van Burnham, author of Supercade, curator of one of the most remarkable private collections in gaming history, and someone who has been right about games being art for longer than most of us have been paying attention. Links in the show notes, and please follow or subscribe to Replay wherever you listen. It really does help us a lot. Thank you so much. I'm Greg Off, and this is Replay.